The Grand Assembly chamber erupted into chaos the moment High Mediator Desik announced the vote. Delegates shouted across the aisles at each other in a dozen different languages, while the translation matrices struggled to keep up with the overlapping arguments. Some demanded that humanity be rejected outright and their ambassador expelled from the station immediately. Others argued just as loudly that this was exactly the kind of decisive action the coalition had needed for decades. Ambassador Yeonsu Park stood calmly at the center of the storm, her burning eyes watching the chaos unfold without visible concern. She had said what she came to say. Now the decision rested with others. High Mediator Desik called for a recess to allow delegates to consult with their home governments before the formal vote. The chamber began to empty as representatives scattered to their various communication terminals throughout the station. Yeonsu remained where she was. She had nowhere else to go, and the security protocols still prevented her from leaving the designated speaking area without escort. She was surprised when Desik himself descended from his podium and approached her directly. Ambassador Park, he said, and his crystalline voice was quieter than it had been during the formal proceedings. May I speak with you privately? Of course, High Mediator. Desik glanced around to ensure that no other delegates remained within earshot before continuing. I have served this coalition for 40 years, he said. I have mediated disputes between species that have been at war for centuries, and I have helped negotiate peace treaties that ended conflicts most believed would never be resolved. That is an impressive record of service. Yeonsu acknowledged. It is a record built on caution and compromise and the careful balancing of competing interests. Desik replied, I have always believed that patience and diplomacy could solve any problem if given enough time. He paused, and his crystalline form flickered with something that looked almost like pain. But some problems do not wait for diplomacy to catch up with them. Yeonsu said nothing, sensing that the High Mediator needed to speak without interruption. When I was young, before I entered diplomatic service, I had a family, Desik continued. A mate and 2 children who were the center of my existence. They lived on a colony world in what is now the disputed border region with the Outer Reach. Yeonsu felt her heart grow heavy as she understood where this story was going. Syndicate raiders struck our colony when the children were still young, Desik said, and his voice had become very quiet indeed. The coalition was asked for assistance, but the attack was classified as an internal security matter rather than an external threat. No help was sent. By the time local defense forces responded, the raiders had already departed with their cargo. His crystalline form flickered rapidly through colors that the translator could not name. My maiden children were among those taken, he said. I never saw them again. Yeonsu reached out and placed her hand gently on the High Mediator's arm. It was a human gesture of comfort that she was not sure he would understand, but it was all she had to offer. I am deeply sorry for your loss, she said softly. Desik looked down at her hand on his arm, and then back up at her burning eyes. I have spent 40 years trying to change the coalition from within, he said. I believed that if I rose high enough in the diplomatic ranks, I could eventually push for the reforms that would prevent other families from suffering as mine did. But the coalition does not change easily. Every proposal for expanded intervention is blocked by delegates who fear the costs. Every call for action against the syndicate is buried under committees and studies and legal opinions. He straightened his crystalline form with what seemed like great effort. I have never cast a deciding vote in any major policy decision during my entire tenure as High Mediator, he said. I have always believed that my role was to remain neutral and to facilitate consensus among the member species. But there comes a time when neutrality becomes complicity. Yeonsu met his gaze steadily. What are you telling me, High Mediator? "I am telling you that I cannot bring your family back," Desic replied. "And I cannot undo the decades of inaction that have allowed the Syndicate to grow into the threat it has become. But I can make sure that no one else has to wait for a rescue that never comes." The recess ended and delegates began. Filtering back into the chamber, Thesic returned to his podium, while Yeon-Su resumed her position at the center of the speaking floor. The vote was called one by one. The delegations registered their positions on the proposed alliance with humanity. Decellas voted yes unanimously, their soft voices carrying a fierce determination that surprised many who had always thought of them as timid and fearful. The Mordith delegation was split, with Commander Krethval casting his personal vote in favor after a long moment of visible deliberation. The Velathari were divided as well, with the older delegates voting against and the younger ones voting in favor. When the count was tallied, the result was a tie. The chamber fell silent as everyone turned to look at High Mediator Desic. For 40 years, he had abstained from every deciding vote. For 40 years, he had maintained perfect neutrality. Thesic looked out across the assembly, and then he turned to face Yeon-Su Park with her burning eyes and her unwavering determination. "I vote in favor of the alliance," he said, and his crystalline voice rang through the chamber like a bell. The chamber erupted once more, but this time the chaos was different. Some delegates shouted in outrage, while others cried out in celebration. The Seleth delegation was openly weeping with what appeared to be relief and hope. Commander Krethval pushed through the crowd and approached Yeon-Su directly. He towered over her small human frame, his blade arms clicking and his compound eyes studying her with an intensity that would have frightened most beings. "I have a question for you, Ambassador Park," he said. "Ask it." "Your eyes," he said. "They burn when you speak of protecting others. And I have wondered since you first entered this chamber why that is so." Yeon-Su looked up at the massive Mordith warrior without fear or hesitation. "Because I have seen what happens when no one fights," she answered. "I have seen the refugees and the survivors and the empty places where families used to live before the raiders came. And I decided a long time ago that I would be the one who does fight. Not because fighting brings me joy, but because standing by while innocents suffer would destroy something inside me that I am not willing to lose." Krethval was silent for a long moment as he processed her words. Then he inclined his great armored head in a gesture that she recognized as profound respect among his people. "I believe I understand humans now," he said slowly. "You are not the beasts we prepared for today. You are fire, and fire, properly directed, can burn away the darkness that threatens to consume everything we hold dear." Yeon-Su smiled at him, and for the first time since she had entered the chamber, there was warmth in her expression. "Now you are beginning to understand," she said. "High Mediator." Desic approached them as the chamber continued to buzz with excited conversation around them. "Ambassador Park," he said formally, "on behalf of the Galactic Coalition, I welcome humanity as our newest alliance partner. And speaking personally," he added in a quieter voice, "I thank you for giving an old diplomat something he had nearly forgotten how to feel." "What is that, High Mediator?" "Hope." Yeon-Su extended her hand once more in the human gesture of partnership. This time, Desic reached out and took it without hesitation around them. The chamber continued to swirl with activity as delegates began the work of turning this historic vote into practical policy. The coalition had braced for a monster when they opened their doors to humanity. They had prepared for a beast from a death world who would threaten and intimidate and demand submission through displays of terrifying strength. Instead, they had found something that frightened them even more deeply than any monster could have. They had found a species that looked into the darkness of the galaxy and refused to accept that darkness as inevitable, a species that would burn itself to ash before abandoning Those who needed protection, a species that had decided, with absolute and unwavering conviction, that some things were worth fighting for no matter the cost. The coalition had braced for a beast, but what walked through their doors that day was something far more dangerous. It was a woman, with eyes ablaze, and behind her stood all of humanity, ready to light the way home. The silence that had fallen over the Grand Assembly chamber stretched on for what felt like an eternity. High Mediator Desik stood at his podium, with his crystalline form flickering through colors that no translator could interpret, shifting from pale fear to something darker and more complex with each passing moment. Finally, a Velathari delegate rose from the middle tiers of seating. "Ambassador Park," he said, and his voice was steadier than Desik would have expected. "If what you say about Jericho is true, then humanity is indeed as dangerous as our intelligence reports suggested." "That is correct," Yansu agreed without hesitation. "But you have also shown us something unexpected," the delegate continued. "You have shown us that human aggression can be directed outward in defense of others rather than simply inward for conquest and domination." "Also correct." The delegate spread his crystalline hands in a gesture of uncertainty. "Then I must ask the obvious question that everyone in this chamber is thinking right now. If humans are so willing to protect others, so ready to sacrifice themselves for strangers, then why should the coalition fear you at all?" Yansu smiled, and once again it was not a comforting expression. "You should not fear us," she said simply, "unless you give us something to protect." The chamber erupted in confused murmurs and whispered. Conversations Commander Krethval stepped forward with his blade arms clicking against his thorax. "Explain yourself," he demanded. Yansu turned to face him directly. "Humanity is not asking for membership in your coalition today," she said. "We are not here to demand territory or resources or political power of any kind." "Then why are you here?" Desik asked from his podium. "To offer you something that your coalition has never had before." She turned to address the full assembly once more. "I have studied the history of your coalition for many years," she said. "I have read the records of every major conflict, every diplomatic crisis, every threat that has challenged your unity since the founding of this body. And I have noticed a pattern that troubles me deeply." Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "The Harrow Syndicate has been expanding its operations in the Outer Reach for the past decade," Yansu continued. "They have enslaved entire populations, harvested sentient beings for labor and worse, and carved out a territory that now spans 17 systems. And the coalition has done nothing to stop them." High Mediator Desik's form flickered with what might have been shame. "The Syndicate operates beyond our established borders," he said defensively. "We do not have the legal authority to intervene in their territory. The Selith refugees that Captain Cho died to protect were fleeing Syndicate operations," Yansu replied. "How many more refugees will have to flee before the coalition decides that legal authority matters less than sentient lives?" The Selith delegation was nodding in agreement with her words. "The coalition has the largest combined fleet in the known galaxy," Yansu pressed on. "You have the resources and the technology and the numbers to crush the Syndicate in a matter of months if you chose to act. You have chosen not to act, because war is costly," a Mordith delegate called out from his section. "Because lives would be lost and resources expended, and the political stability of the coalition would be threatened." "Yes," Yansu agreed. "Those are exactly the reasons that have been given for decades of inaction, while the Syndicate grows stronger and bolder with each passing year." She stepped forward again until the energy barriers hummed in warning. "Humanity is offering you another option," she said. "We are offering you an alliance." The chamber went silent once more. "Human ships," she continued. "Human soldiers and pilots and engineers who will fight the battles that your coalition is unwilling to fight for itself. Human stubbornness and human determination and human refusal to accept Defeat in service of worlds that cannot defend themselves. Commander Krethval made a sound that might have been a laugh. Humanity is a young species, he said. You have been in space for barely 2 centuries, and your population is a fraction of most coalition members. What could you possibly offer that would make a difference against an enemy like the Syndicate? Yansu's eyes seemed to burn brighter as she answered him. We offer you the one thing your coalition has never had, she said. We offer you people who will not stop, people who do not calculate acceptable losses when children are being taken into slavery, people who will make your enemies afraid to sleep at night because they know that somewhere out there, humans are coming for them. She let those words hang in the air for a moment. 7 ordinary humans held off 37 professional raiders for 11 hours. She reminded them, not because they were stronger or better armed or tactically superior, because they had decided that those 53 refugees were worth dying for, and nothing in the universe was going to change their minds. Imagine what happens when we decide that the victims of the Harrow Syndicate are worth dying for. High Mediator. Thesik's crystalline form had stopped flickering and had settled into a color that the translator identified as deep contemplation. What you are proposing would fundamentally alter the nature of this coalition, he said slowly. We have always been a defensive alliance, a body that protects its members from external threats. And how has that worked out for the species beyond your borders? Yansu asked. How has it worked out for the Seleth who had to flee their homes because no one was willing to fight for them? She turned to face the Seleth delegation directly. Your people have been members of this coalition for over a century, she said to them. When the Syndicate began raiding your colonies in the disputed territories, how many coalition ships came to help you? The Seleth delegate who had spoken earlier bowed his head in shame. None, he admitted quietly. The territory was outside the coalition's defensive perimeter, so no aid was authorized. And how many of your people have been taken by Syndicate harvesters since then? We do not have exact numbers, the delegate replied, but estimates suggest at least 40,000 over the past 15 years. A ripple of shock passed through the chamber. 40,000 sentient beings, Yansu repeated, taken into slavery while the most powerful alliance in the galaxy debated legal authority and acceptable costs. She turned back to face Thesik. Humanity is not asking you to trust us, she said. We know that trust must be earned through actions rather than words alone. We are asking you to let us prove what we are. She extended her hand toward the High Mediator in a human gesture of partnership and agreement. Point us at the Syndicate, she said. Give us the information and the coordinates and the authorization to operate in the outer reach. And then watch what happens when humans decide that something is worth fighting for. The silence that followed was different from the fearful quiet that had filled the chamber before. This silence was heavy with possibility, and the first stirrings of something that might have been hope. Commander Krethval was the first to break it. And if we refuse? He asked. What then? Yansu lowered her hand but did not step back. Then we will fight the Syndicate anyway, she said simply, because we have already decided that the beings they prey upon are worth protecting. But we would rather fight alongside the coalition than alone. We would rather build something new together than watch from the sidelines while your alliance continues to fail the people who need it most. She met Thesik's eyes directly. The choice is yours, High Mediator, but I promise you this, whatever you decide today, humanity will not stand by while innocents suffer. That is not who we are. The High Mediator stared at the human woman with burning eyes for a long moment. Then he turned to face the assembly. I believe we need to call a vote, he said quietly. The Grand Assembly chamber had never been so quiet in all its long history of hosting contentious debates and heated arguments. Ambassador Yansu Park stood at the center of that silence, like the eye of a gathering storm. The Freighter was called the Bright Horizon, she began, and her voice carried to every corner of the vast room without effort. It was a civilian transport vessel with no weapons and minimal defensive systems. Just a simple cargo hauler making runs between the outer colonies and the central trade hubs. She paused to let the translation matrices finish their work. The crew was 7 humans, she continued. Captain Minjun Cho was 62 years old and had been flying freight routes for 30 years. And he took the job because he liked the quiet of space and the simplicity of honest work. Several delegates shifted in their seats at the mention of age for most species. 62 years was well past the prime of life. Engineer Su Yeon-beek was the youngest at 24, Yeon-su said. She had just graduated from technical school and had taken the position to gain experience before applying to the larger shipping companies. The other 5 crew members were equally unremarkable by human standards, she added. They were not soldiers or warriors or trained fighters of any kind, just ordinary people doing an ordinary job. Commander Krethval made a sound of disbelief through his mandibles. The reports indicate that these 7 individuals held off a raider force for 11 hours, he said. How is that possible if they had no combat training? I will explain, Yeon-su replied. But first you must understand who else was on that ship. She turned to face the Seleth delegation directly. The Bright Horizon was carrying passengers on that particular voyage, she said. 53 Seleth refugees who were fleeing a territorial dispute in the Kethmaran sector. The Seleth delegates went very still at her words. 19 of those refugees were children. Yeon-su continued. Some of them were infants still being carried by their parents. She let that information settle over the assembly before speaking again. The raiders who intercepted the Bright Horizon were not simple thieves looking for cargo to steal, she said. And her voice had grown hard as stone. They were harvesters. A ripple of revulsion passed through the chamber. Every species in the coalition knew what that term meant. Harvesters were the worst kind of criminals in the galaxy. Beings who captured sentient creatures and sold them to labor camps or worse. The Seleth were the target. Yeon-su said, 53 soft-furred. Gentle beings who would fetch high prices in the underground markets of the outer systems. 19 children who would grow up as slaves if they were lucky, or be disposed of if they were not. She turned back to face Desik and Krethval at the front of the chamber. When the raiders demanded that Captain Cho surrender his passengers, he refused when they threatened to destroy his ship with all hands aboard. He still refused when they boarded the Bright Horizon with 37 armed fighters. Captain Cho and his crew of 6 ordinary humans picked up whatever tools and implements they could find and prepared to defend 53 strangers they had known for exactly 3 days. The chamber was utterly silent as Yeon-su continued her account. The first wave of raiders expected easy prey, she said. They found Engineer Beek waiting for them at the airlock with a plasma torch and a complete unwillingness to die. She held that corridor for 45 minutes by herself before the others could establish secondary barricades deeper in the ship. High Meteor Desik's crystalline form had gone pale as she spoke. The raiders were professional criminals with military-grade weapons and body armor. Yeon-su said, the humans had maintenance tools and cargo straps and whatever else they could improvise in the weapons on short notice. By any reasonable calculation, the fight should have been over within the first hour at most. She paused and let her burning gaze sweep across the assembly. It lasted 11 hours. Captain Cho took 3 wounds in the first 2 hours of fighting, she continued. A blade across his ribs, a burn on his shoulder, and a deep cut on his thigh that should have dropped him to the floor and kept him there. He fought for 9 more hours after sustaining those injuries. Navigator Han Wu-Kang lost 2 fingers on his left hand during the 3rd hour and cauterized the stumps himself so he could keep fighting. Cargo handler Ji Yeon-moon broke her arm in the 5th hour and used the broken limb as a club when her other weapons failed. Yansu's voice never wavered as she recited these horrors. The raiders could not understand what they were facing, she said. They had fought other species before, and they knew that most beings would surrender or flee or simply collapse from shock and blood loss when pushed past certain limits. The humans did none of those things. Every time the raiders thought they had finally won, another human would appear from the shadows with makeshift weapons and burning determination in their eyes. Every time they cornered one of the crew, that human would fight until they physically could not move anymore. And even then they would try to crawl toward the enemy. She turned to face the Seleth delegation once more. 4 of the 7 humans died during those 11 hours, she said softly. Captain Cho was the last to fall, and he died carrying a Seleth child to the final escape pod with his body between the child and the raiders who were trying to stop him. The Seleth delegates were weeping openly now, their soft gray fur wet with tears. The remaining 3 humans held the corridor long enough for the escape pods to launch. Yansu continued, and when Coalition patrol ships finally arrived in response to the distress signal, they found those 3 standing over the bodies of their fallen crewmates, still ready to fight despite wounds that should have killed them hours before. She let silence fill the chamber for a long moment. 53 Seleth refugees survived that day, she said finally. 19 children who are alive right now because 7 ordinary humans decided that some things are worth dying for. High Mediator Desek finally found his voice. Why? He asked, and the words seemed pulled from somewhere deep inside him. Why would they sacrifice themselves for strangers of another species? Yansu turned to face him with eyes that burned like distant stars, because they looked at those refugees and saw people who needed protection. She answered simply, because they could not stand by and watch children be taken into slavery while they had breath in their bodies and strength in their limbs. Because that is what humans do. She stepped forward until she was at the very edge of her designated speaking area. You prepared for a beast today, she said to the assembly. You brought weapons and barriers and containment systems because you expected a monster to walk through those doors. But beasts do not die for strangers. Monsters do not hold the line for 11 hours to protect people they barely knew. We are not beasts. High Mediator. Her voice rose until it filled every corner of the chamber. We are something far more dangerous than that. We are people who have decided what matters to us. And we will burn ourselves to ash before we let anyone take those things away. She let her burning gaze sweep across the silent assembly one final time. Now you know what really happened at Jericho, she said. And now you must decide what that knowledge means for the future of your coalition. The silence that followed was heavy with fear and wonder, and something that might have been the first fragile seeds of respect. Ambassador Yeonsu Park stood alone in the center of the Grand Assembly Chamber, surrounded by 300 aliens who wanted nothing more than to flee from her presence. She could feel their fear like heat radiating. From afar it did not surprise her in the least. She had read the intelligence reports that the coalition had compiled about humanity, and she understood exactly what these beings saw when they looked at her. They saw a predator from a world of predators. They saw a monster wearing a diplomatic suit. They saw death walking on 2 legs with burning eyes, and she could not entirely blame them for that perception. Either High Mediator Desek stood rigid at his podium, his crystalline body throwing nervous rainbows across the floor as he trembled almost imperceptibly. Ambassador Park, he began, and his translated voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone reciting a prepared statement. On behalf of the Galactic Coalition, I must inform you of certain protocols that have been established for this meeting. Of course, Yansu replied calmly. You will remain within the designated speaking area at all times during these proceedings. and any attempt to leave that area will be met with immediate defensive response from our security forces. I understand. Furthermore, any sudden movements or aggressive displays will trigger the automated containment systems that have been installed around your current position. That seems reasonable given the circumstances. Desik paused at her easy acceptance of these restrictions. He had clearly expected argument or anger or perhaps a threat in response to his words. Her calm agreement seemed to unsettle him more than resistance would have done. Commander Krethval stepped forward from his position near the main doors, his massive insectoid form blocking the exit completely. You are remarkably composed for a creature standing alone in a room full of armed beings who fear you, he observed, his mandibles clicking with what might have been suspicion. Yansu turned to face him directly. Should I not be composed? She asked simply. Most beings in your position would show some sign of concern for their own safety at the very least. Commander, I have read your service record, and I know that you have personally led forces against raider fleets that outnumbered your own ships 10-1. Without hesitation, Krethval's blade arms twitched in surprise at her words. You did not show concern for your own safety in those engagements. Yansu continued, because you believed in what you were fighting for, and that belief was stronger than your fear. She let her gaze sweep across the chamber once more. I believe in why I'm here today, and that belief is stronger than any fear your weapons could create in me. The chamber was utterly silent for a long moment after she spoke finally. High Mediator Desik cleared his throat with a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Perhaps we should proceed with the formal address, he suggested. Ambassador Park, you requested this audience to speak on behalf of humanity to the Galactic Coalition, and the floor is now yours. Yansu nodded her thanks and turned to face the assembled delegates directly. She did not begin with demands or threats or displays of power. Instead, she began with a story. When I was a child, she said, I lived with my grandmother in a small apartment in a city called Seoul on our homeworld of Earth. Several delegates exchanged confused glances at this unexpected opening. My grandmother was a survivor. Yansu continued. When she was young, a terrible war swept across our land and destroyed almost everything she had ever known or loved. She paused to let the translation matrices carry her words to every ear in the chamber. She lost her parents and her brothers and her home and nearly her own life as well. And by the time the war ended, she had nothing left but the clothes she wore and the determination to keep breathing. The Seleth delegates had stopped their nervous fidgeting. Their large dark eyes were fixed on Yansu with something that might have been recognition. My grandmother rebuilt her life from nothing, Yansu said. She found work and saved money and eventually started a small business of her own. And when she had children, she worked even harder to give them opportunities she had never had. This is a touching story. A Voluthari delegate interrupted from the middle rows. But what does it have to do with why humanity should be granted representation in this coalition? Yansu smiled at the interruption without taking offense. I am getting to that point, she assured him. You see, my grandmother taught me many things over the years we spent together, and the most important lesson she ever gave me was this. She paused and let her voice drop to something softer but no less intense. She told me that strength without purpose is just violence, and violence without meaning destroys everything it touches, including the one who wields it. The chamber had grown very still now. My grandmother was one of the strongest people I have ever known, Yansu said. She survived things that would have broken most beings of any species, and she came out the other side still capable of love and hope and kindness. She met Desik's eyes directly as she continued. She was not strong because she could destroy her enemies, though she certainly could have done so if she had chosen that path instead. She was strong because she knew what she wanted to protect, and she never let anything turn her away from that purpose, no matter how hard the road became. Mortith delegate near Commander Krethval shifted in his seat and spoke up. Humans are known throughout the galaxy as the most dangerous species to have achieved spaceflight in recorded history, he said bluntly. Your own reports describe your kind as persistence predators, who form pack bonds and fight to the death for those bonds without hesitation or retreat. That is accurate. Ian-Su agreed. Then how can you stand there and speak of purpose and protection as if you are not simply apex predators wearing the mask of civilization? Because being dangerous and being monstrous are not the same thing. Ian-Su replied without hesitation. A blade can be used to murder innocents or to defend those who cannot defend themselves. And the blade itself does not determine which purpose it serves. She turned to address the full assembly once more. Yes, humans are dangerous, she admitted freely. We evolved on a world that tried to kill us every single day of our existence. And we survived because we learned to be more stubborn and more adaptable and more relentless than anything. That haunted us. Her eyes seemed to burn brighter as she spoke, but we also evolved something else on that death world of ours, she said. We evolved the capacity to look at a stranger and decide that their survival matters as much as our own. We evolved the ability to form bonds that transcend species and circumstance and even basic survival instinct. We evolved purpose. She let that word hang in the air for a moment before continuing. And that brings me to the question that I know is on all of your minds right now. She turned to face the section where the Seleth delegations sat huddled together. You want to know about Jericho, she said, and her voice had gone cold and hard as iron. You want to know what really happened when 7 humans faced a raider force that outnumbered them dozens to 1. The Seleth delegate, who had asked about Jericho, earlier flinched back from her burning gaze. You want to know if the stories are true, Ian-Su continued. If humans really are the monsters that your nightmares have made us out to be. She turned back to face Thesic and Krethval at the front of the chamber. Very well then, she said. I will tell you about Jericho. Her hands unfolded from their position in front of her and dropped to her sides. But I warn you now that the truth is far more frightening than any monster story you have imagined. The silence that followed was absolute. Every being in that chamber held their breath and waited for the human with burning eyes to speak again. The emergency alert had been active for 3 standard hours aboard Harmony's Edge, and every species on the diplomatic station knew exactly why a human was coming. High Mediator Thesic stood at the central podium of the Grand Assembly Chamber, his crystalline body catching the overhead lights and scattering them into pale rainbows across the polished floor beneath him. He had served the Galactic Coalition for 40 years and had never once activated the station's full defensive protocols. For a diplomatic visit today was different, report, he said, his voice resonating through the translation matrices that lined the chamber walls. Commander Krethval of the Mortith Defensive Corps stepped forward, his massive insectoid frame casting a shadow that stretched halfway across the speaking floor. All barriers are active. High Mediator, he reported, his mandibles clicking with each syllable. We have positioned armed guards at every entrance and exit, and the emergency evacuation routes have been cleared and tested twice in the last hour alone. And the containment measures? Tranquilizer systems are loaded and ready to deploy at your command. And energy barriers can be raised around the human's designated speaking area within half a second of activation. Thesic nodded slowly. Though the gesture brought him no comfort whatsoever, he turned to face the assembled delegates who filled the curved rows of seats that rose in tiers around the central floor. 300 representatives from over 60 species had gathered here today, and not one of them looked calm about the situation at hand. The Velethari delegation sat nearest to the podium, their bodies similar to Thesik's own crystalline form, though they varied in color from deep violet to pale blue, depending on their emotional state. Most of them had gone very pale indeed. The Morith occupied an entire section by themselves, their hulking armored bodies taking up twice the space of most other species in attendance. They had brought their ceremonial weapons despite the strict protocols against such things, and Thesik had chosen not to object to this particular violation of the rules. The Seleth huddled together in small family groups, their soft gray fur bristling with anxiety as their large dark eyes darted toward the main entrance every few seconds without fail. They were prey species by evolution, and their instincts were screaming at them to flee from this place immediately. Thesik understood that feeling all too well right now. He pulled up the intelligence briefing on his personal display once more. Though he had already memorized every word contained within the document SPCI's designation: human, Homo sapiens, homeworld, Earth, classification, category 9, death world, threat assessment, extreme. The details that followed were the stuff of nightmares for any civilized species in the galaxy. Humans were persistent predators who had evolved on a world where nearly everything wanted to kill them at all times. They could function through injuries that would incapacitate or kill most other sentient beings without much difficulty. They formed pack bonds not only with their own kind, but with other species as well. And once bonded, they would fight to the death to protect those they considered their own. They did not retreat when wounded, but often became more dangerous instead. They could survive on minimal sleep, minimal food, and minimal water for extended periods when motivated by sufficient cause. They had domesticated wolves by convincing the apex predators to hunt alongside them as partners and equals, and, perhaps most disturbing of all, they found the void of space exciting rather than terrifying in the least. "High Mediator," a voice called out from the Seleth delegation. "Is it true what they say about the incident at Jericho Station last year?" The chamber went silent at the mention of that name. Thesik felt his crystalline structure vibrate with tension as he considered how to respond to the question. "The reports have been verified," he said carefully. "A human freighter crew engaged a raider force that outnumbered them significantly in that encounter. For 11 hours, another delegate added, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "Yes, for 11 hours without rest or retreat of any kind. And the raiders? None survived the encounter." A ripple of fear passed through the assembly like a wave through water. Commander Krethval shifted his weight, his blade arms clicking against his thorax in what Thesik recognized as a Mordith gesture of unease. "I have studied the tactical recordings from that engagement," the commander said. "The humans sustained injuries that should have rendered them combat ineffective within the first hour of fighting. Yet they continued to fight regardless of their wounds. How is that possible?" A Velethari delegate demanded to know, unknown at this time. But the leading theory suggests that humans can consciously suppress their pain responses when they deem the situation important enough to warrant such extreme measures. The Seleth delegate, who had first spoken, made a small sound of distress in response to this information. "Why are we allowing one of these creatures onto our station then?" he asked. "Why are we not evacuating instead of sitting here waiting?" Thesik raised a hand for silence before answering the question. "Because humanity has made formal contact with the coalition and requested diplomatic representation in this body," he explained. "They have achieved faster than light travel. They have established colonies beyond their home system, and they have made it clear that they will be part of galactic affairs whether we invite them or not. Then we should prepare for war immediately. That is precisely what we are trying to avoid here today." The main doors hummed as a notification signal flashed across every display in the chamber. Simultaneously, "The human shuttle has docked," Commander Krethval announced. "The ambassador is being escorted through decontamination protocols as we speak right now." Desik straightened his form and tried to project calm authority to those watching him. "Remember why we are here today," he said to the assembly. "Humanity is young and aggressive and dangerous beyond measure. But they are not mindless beasts despite what our fears tell us. And they have asked to speak before this body, rather than simply taking what they want by force. Which suggests they may be reasoned with after all. Or they are studying us before they attack." Someone muttered from the back rows of seats. Desik chose not to respond to that particular comment. The doors began to open with a slow mechanical groan. Every weapon in the chamber rose as one. Every energy barrier hummed to full power. Immediately every delegate pressed back in their seats as far as they could manage. Desik felt his crystalline heart pulse with ancient fear as the gap between the doors widened to reveal the corridor beyond them, and then she walked in. The human ambassador was small. That was Desik's first confused thought as he watched her enter the chamber. Alone she stood barely taller than a Seleth, her frame slight and unarmored beneath a simple gray suit of formal clothing. Her skin was a warm brown tone, and her dark hair was pulled back from her face in a simple style that revealed features that seemed almost delicate compared to the monsters Desik had been imagining. But her eyes caught the chamber lights and seemed to hold them, burning with an intensity that made Desik's crystalline form ring with instinctive alarm. She was not large or armored or visibly armed in any way at all yet. Every being in that chamber felt the weight of her gaze as she surveyed them without fear or hesitation. She walked to the center of the speaking floor and stopped there. She did not flinch at the weapons pointed at her from every direction. She did not react to the energy barriers, humming with lethal potential mere meters from where she stood. She simply folded her hands before her and waited in perfect stillness. The silence stretched until it became unbearable to those watching. Finally, Desik found his voice once more. "Welcome to Harmony's Edge," he said, and even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow with barely concealed terror. "I am High Mediator Desik of the Galactic Coalition, and you stand before the Grand Assembly." The human woman smiled. Then it was not a comforting expression in the slightest. "Thank you, High Mediator," she said, and her voice was calm and clear and carried to every corner of the vast chamber without effort. "My name is Yonsu Park, and I am honored to be here." She paused and let her burning gaze sweep across the assembled delegates. "One more time, I can see you have prepared quite a welcome for me," she continued, "and I want you to know that I understand completely why you have done so." Her smile faded into something harder and more serious. "Shall we begin?"